Americans have died for this at the instigation of Israel to no material benefit to our country. And everyone knows that. There's no denying it. That's not a conspiracy theory. It's just a fact. And now it's completely out in the open. What we're watching is a change of power globally. What's happening in Iran is the end of American empire as we understand it.
Following Trump's primetime speech on the Iran war last night, Tucker Carlson just released a monologue declaring that the Iran war itself represents the end of American empire as we know it. What are the ramifications of that on Americans, how we're looking forward? What does that mean for the balance of power in the world? And how insane was it that Americans died for Israel's sake in this war? Tucker breaks those things down right here. Let's take a look at what he has to say. Please like the video and subscribe to the channel.
So the three headlines from the president's speech last night, at least in the short term, are no ground troops, didn't mention ground troops. Yes, we are getting out in some number of weeks by the end of April. And there's not going to be regime change. Regime change, as he said explicitly, is not our goal. So are those true? Well, of course, you can't tell. You can't know at this point. As Trump himself said, this has been a very short engagement relative to, say, the First or Second World War or Vietnam. But all of those wars began with similar promises. This won't last long, back by fall, all the kind of famous slogans that we chuckle about, ironically, decades later. They had no idea what they were getting into. And that is true, again, for every conflict. The second people start dying, you really don't know where it's going to end. And that goes for this conflict, too. And all kinds of things could happen between right now and resolution. And some of them are awful. And there are also, by the way, signs that there is, as there always is, quite a distance between what politicians tell us and what they're actually planning to do or what they may do. So, for example, in the question of ground troops, the president didn't mention them last night, but they are apparently on the way. So American troops are on the way to the Persian Gulf, including portions of the Nevada National Guard for some reason. So either that's a statement of intent, the administration does plan to put boots on the ground, or it's an option they want to keep open. But either way, that very much could happen, particularly if the U.S. decides we need actual regime change. We need to subdue the country completely, change its leadership.
Yeah, and of course, Trump actually boasted about regime change not only being an aim prior to that speech over and over in press conferences. He said that it had been consummated by the United States, that a regime change had happened. We'll talk about that in a second. But the omission of mentioning ground troops in this speech really says nothing about what's planning to happen. It seems like Trump is at least setting the stage for a possible escalation here. And by saying that it will wind down in April is actually giving us essentially no tangible information either, because from the outset of this war, I believe in early March, we've been told, hey, this would be a day's operation. This would be a weeks-long operation. We're still hearing it now. It was just put in a primetime speech. So who knows if that's the actual time frame. Half of that speech seemed to be, a victory march. Look at how much we've done, even though, yeah, our bases have been destroyed in the region. 13 service members have been killed. Might be more than that. That might be an underestimation. There's an energy crisis caused by the blockage and closure of the Strait of Hormuz. And the United States killed innocent girls at a school. All these things are way worse than the status quo. Trump had to try to sell that as a victory, but he also said, hey, we're going to knock them into the Stone Age pretty soon if they don't agree to a new deal. Well, again, that's setting the stage for a possible escalation. And it's just so absurd when he launched this war saying, hey, this is to help the Iranian people. No, I'm sorry. That's not why the U.S. launches wars. It launches wars for the sake of Netanyahu's ambitions. That's what the truth is.
Man, unconditional surrender. None of those things can be achieved. It is pretty much believed by air power alone. So that could happen, and it could accelerate in other ways too, probably too horrible even to think about, including the use of non-conventional weapons, nuclear weapons of some kind. And the effects of that would be what we don't know, because those weapons have never been used. the kind of nuclear weapons that modern nations possess are not even that closely related to the only ones that have ever been used 80 years ago in Japan. So what would happen next? Again, we can only guess, but it would be awful.
It would be awful, and it has no chance of happening from the Iranians, who didn't have nuclear weapons. They didn't even have a secret nuclear weapon program that had been restarted, according to Tulsi Gabbard of this administration. Yeah, Trump's DNI back in her annual threat summary just last year. But guess who does have a secret nuclear weapons program? Israel. So if there's a nuclear detonation in the region, it's almost certainly going to be Israel's doing. The Samson option, you can read about that. But Israel makes no bones about the fact that they have this documentation. They're, outwardly they say, hey, we don't acknowledge a program, but they do have the program. They stole it from the United States. The only president that tried to really shut that down in the early 60s got offed by chance and coincidence, I guess, 1 year after that. And they supposedly have 300 warheads. But yeah, it might be Iran's doing. This is so preposterous. Just 8 to 9 months ago, Trump had broadcast that the B-2 bombers at Fordow and Nahanz and Isfahan had destroyed the uranium enrichment by Iran. And supposedly we still had to go back to bomb them to prevent them from getting a nuke after having destroyed the material anyways. It doesn't even make sense.
So those questions were partly answered last night, but they're not really the right questions that we should be asking, because this is not just a war in Iran. It is, well, really, it's a pivot in history. What we're watching is a change of power globally. And so the questions we really should be thinking about, and that we're going to get the answers to fairly soon, would include who runs the world? Who's in charge of the world? Where are the real power centers? What is the nature of power? What does it mean to have power? How do you know if a country's powerful? Where does our power derive? Why is the United States a power exactly? And finally, what is the United States? Who are we? How do we understand ourselves? What do we stand for? What's our national character? Is there one? What are we defending when we go to war?
Well, the truth is Netanyahu and his territorial ambitions in the Middle East. And that wasn't just true in regard to this war, this Iran war that the U.S. is participating in, but also in Syria and Somalia and Libya. Also countries that were on the list of 7 countries that the United States, the neocons in power at the time, and the Israeli government headed by Ariel Sharon, with Benjamin Netanyahu as a prime feature, selling the Iraq war to the public, wanted. This is for the sake of greater Israel to destabilize perceived adversaries, different centers of power in the Middle East for Israel's territorial hegemony. That's the truth. It's an empire-building scheme above all other empire-building schemes that we've seen in my lifetime. That's the truth, and this war shows that the U.S. it just isn't in a unipolar moment anymore. There are other rising powers, and even powers that are not even nearly on the same level of playing field as the United States can do immense damage, not only to our service members, but our bases in the region, and really set off an energy crisis that wasn't caused by the Iranians, but was caused by the criminal United States and Israeli governments acting in this immoral and unconstitutional war.
So those are the questions that, whether we want to ask or not, and they're almost never discussed in public for some reason, that we're going to get the answers to very soon, because conflict forces an answer to these questions, and this conflict in particular. This is a world war, which is to say the world, every nation in the world, while not obviously directly engaged in it, has a stake in the outcome. And the future of every country will be determined in part by what happens in Iran. What's happening in Iran is the end of American empire as we understand it. And that's sad. Boo-hoo, empire's dying. But it's not the end of the United States. It's not the end of our influence on other nations, hopefully positive influence. It's not the end of our economy. It's the beginning of a very rough time in our economy, of course. But it's hardly the end of it. What we've been doing for likely your lifetime, if you're under 80, is Well, it's not working anymore. It hasn't actually helped the United States long term. Your grandkids at this point don't have the promise of a better life than you had. So it's not actually a successful experiment. And now it's ending because we've reached the limits of our demonstrated power. We can't open the Straits of Hormuz. The President of the United States said that last night. Someone else do it. So we're done. That's okay. It was always going to end. Hopefully we can get out without a nuclear exchange. But now it is ending. And there's going to be a lot of suffering and sadness as a result of that end, but there is an awful lot of promise.
Yeah, as far as the end of the American empire, I'm with Tucker that this has really signaled the end of American empire. Not just this, but other military debacles that have happened in the last years, especially in Ukraine, especially in Iran, etc., do show the limits of U.S. power on a global stage. And certainly, again, we're not in the unipolar moment. We're in a multipolar world where powers like Russia and India and China are rising up against the West in terms of relative power, not in terms of war making. They don't want wars with the United States. That's all propaganda. They wanted to stay out of those wars with the United States while the U.S. and Israel engages in empire building. But at the same time, that moment is ending. But will the United States behave in such a way as that they're an empire? I think they still will. No matter who wins the presidency next time, no matter as the years unfold, the United States will still continue acting as if it's an empire and pushing these powers together in closer concert with each other, like the BRICS countries, which right now are not a military alliance per se like the Warsaw Pact, but they could easily form such an arrangement, and they could even develop an alternative currency that might displace the US dollar as the world reserve currency. That's an even bigger threat to the world economy. So is the US empire over? Well, it's a matter of speaking. Obviously, this war helps signal that it is over, but the United States will still behave absurdly so and counterintuitively so as an empire. That's my thoughts.
Promise that the United States can act in its own interest, that it can be reasonable, that it will not be governed by deranged people seized by hubris or get way out over their skis and get a ton of people killed. You don't have to occupy countries you've never been to, can't identify on a map. I mean, what we're doing doesn't work, whether you approve of it morally or not. And we're going to do something else. And that something else is starting right now. So the only point is, you could, with wise leadership, turn this to the advantage of the United States and the Western Hemisphere very, very easily. And there's one other advantage to this moment, which is that it has been clarifying. All of a sudden, we know what everybody in authority thinks because they've been saying it, because under pressure, people confess. The pressure, of course, is this war, which a lot of people in our commentariat, a lot of people in our government, certainly in our Congress, a lot of people in Israel wanted. They all wanted this. And it didn't work the way they said it would. And even now, it could go really, really wrong. And lots of Americans could die. Really?
Absolutely so. And that's the horrible warning that we have to take into mind. And, you know, I want to look at this in some ways like Tucker Carlson is, to say, hey, this is an opportunity where the United States could course correct, could see what's apparent to dissidents and anti-war activists' eyes for a long time, for many, many years. And that's that the empire building projects aren't working. They aren't serving the American public. They're totally contradictory to our interests. They just compound the debt, exacerbate inflation, and pit neighbors against neighbors over these foreign conflicts that don't have to exist in the first place. We could trade with every corner of the world, benefit mutually with other countries and other powers. But instead, the United States uses sanctions regimes and military strikes and proxy wars to try to get what we want out of the modern empire. So this is a time and juncture in history where you could course correct, but I'm not convinced whatsoever that any real power center in terms of the political machine in Washington will do that. Not Republican, not Democrat. There'll be a new war. There'll be a new sacred cow regime like Israel, even if it's, you know, not Israel in 10 years. You saw that with Ukraine and the Democrats. You see that with Israel and the Republicans. That's generalizing. There's a lot of overlap there, but that's what you have. These entities are impulsive and controlled by lobbies like the banks and military-industrial complex and the Israel lobbies to behave in the ways that they do in regard to foreign affairs. So I don't think we're going to see a course correction, even though that's the ultimate solution right now. That's the remedy to these problems. I just don't think it will be embraced by either party.
Relatively speaking, a lot have died. Oh, the casualty numbers are so low. Okay. How about if that was your son? Would you feel they were low? Americans have died for this at the instigation of Israel to no material benefit to our country. And everyone knows that. There's no denying it. That's not a conspiracy theory. It's just a fact. And now it's completely out in the open. So those ideas, neoconservatism, the preservation of empire, the idea that you take orders from a tiny country far away, all of those things have risen right to the surface, no longer whispered about. We can just say it openly because no one's hiding it anymore. And we can all say they're destructive, stupid, and bad for the United States. So those debates are over. We now know what's going on, and now we can change it.
Yeah, that's the case. We could change it, but will we? If we means any part of the Washington political machine, I'm not so sure. I just sincerely doubt that it will. I mean, Tucker's right. In terms of the battlefield of ideas, neoconservatism and Israel first has died, especially the former. That neoconservatism was supposedly buried in 2016. That was the rise of the never Trumpers, the neocons that said, I can never in good conscience vote for Trump. The National Review articles saying that with prominent figures signing on to that, like Ben Shapiro and Mark Levin, ironically enough, Trump's biggest cheerleaders now. Why? Because Trump sided with Neoconservatism Inc. He sided with Lindsey Graham. He sided with Ben Shapiro and Laura Loomer and Ted Cruz above non-interventionists on the right, the old right wingers like Pat Buchanan and Ron Paul, who always said these things were destructive. Entangling alliances were always wrong. Plunging a country into debt for these regime change wars were always bad ideas. That's the ideas that supposedly had won out in 2016, and the American public and culture was won over to those ideas. That's why so much of it supported Trump. But then you see Trump being co-opted by the same foreign policy mentality as the neocons. They don't call themselves neocons anymore. Why would they? That term has been so tarnished by the likes of Richard Pearl and David Wormser and Dick Cheney and Paul Wolfowitz and Donald Rumsfeld. Douglas Feith. Why would they still use that term? No, but they still want the same policies. So what they do is they package the same policies in a new marketing scheme. It was just called MAGA and Drain the Swamp. That was an electoral vehicle to put them into power and unleash these Israel first wars. That's what we're seeing play out right now. So like Tucker, I think he's right that this could be an inflection point. If there were people of good conscience and people with principled values like Thomas Massie and Marjorie Taylor Greene to some extent, they are few and far between in Washington, but there are some of those. If we had a full Congress full of those types of people, those archetypes, those mentalities, we might see some semblance of virtue and liberty. But we don't have that. So the solution is not to try to, get into the government and change it from the inside. It is indeed to push back at that criminal government through non-compliance and nullification and withholding consent. That's the best thing the American public can do. And Trump's words about, hey, how regime change was never a stated goal. We never said regime change. We never said it at all. Is totally wrong. I broke that down in a full video released earlier today at the time of recording this. But I just think it's worthy to point that out again and just show how absurd this is. That in his primetime speech, he said exactly that. But just hours before, he had been boasting about a regime change happening. Take a look at this. This is crazy.
Regime change was not our goal. We never said regime change, but regime change has occurred. But we also won regime change. I spoke with we have really regime change. This is a change in the regime. But the Washington Post said, what do you mean you have regime change? You didn't have regime change. I said, no. We took out the first regime, 100%. That was Khomeini. Again, we have had regime change. So I never say I wanted it. So I never talked about regime change, but we got it. Finally, to the great, proud people of Iran, I say tonight that the hour of your freedom is at hand. Stay sheltered. Don't leave your home. It's very dangerous outside. Bombs will be dropping everywhere. When we are finished, take over your government. It will be yours to take. This will be probably your only chance for generations.
Your only chance for regime change. Take a look at that. We didn't talk about regime change. And what's so crazy about this is this speech was just hours after the first clip here, and I made this video, where he was in the same suit and same tie, again, boasting about regime change. We want regime change. And then in the speech, just hours later, we never talked about regime change. It's just too absurd. It's being exposed. And really, this administration is laid bare for Israel first. That's what it is. It's an extension of Netanyahu. We might as well be Netanyahu's vassal state. This unholy union that coats the U.S.-Israeli relationship is often referred to with Israel being the so-called vassal state, but it really exercises more leverage and power over our government clearly than vice versa. And now you have word that the Israelis bombed a diplomatic engagement, I think organized by the Pakistanis, for a potential escape hatch from this war, a diplomatic engagement, which is exactly what Israel specializes in, sabotaging any potential negotiations, just like they did back in regard to Gaza in Doha, when they bombed a diplomatic engagement in Qatar, in Doha. That's a U.S. ally. But was any aid ever withheld to the Israelis? No, it never is. Because the Israel lobby, the military-industrial complex, and the banks act in concert to influence our foreign policy in the direction of these wars, not for our benefit, not for the benefit of the American people, the people in our communities, the people we call neighbors, but for the benefit of Netanyahu, a genocidal war criminal of all people on earth. That's who the United States goes to war to benefit. But what do you guys think is right here? Do you think that's accurate? Is what Tucker is saying true? Is this really the end of the U.S. empire, or is the U.S. still going to act like an empire, even if we see the writing on the wall that it really should be the end? You let me know in the comments down below. I'll appreciate that. Please like the video, subscribe to the channel, subscribe to Tucker also. Great monologue, some interesting parts of it, including some others where he talks about like Christian evangelicalism and eschatology and the Israel first mentality that's so pervasive in some churches in the United States. I think that's totally pernicious, I hate to say, but that was part of his monologue too. Also, if you like this video, please consider supporting me via membership. You can do that by clicking the join button down below. And if you do that, you can get immediate access to all my members only content. There's several videos at all times, including now, for you to be able to watch before anyone else if you become a member for a very cheap price. Check that out, and I really appreciate it if you do become a member. And also, if you want a free copy of my first book, Compact of the Republic, click the link in the description down below. That'll send you off to a website. You just plug in your email right there, and I'll send you a full free copy of that work. No obligation whatsoever, totally free of charge. And look, I have some demands from this criminal, Israel first, blood-soaked maniac regime, and I won't apologize for him. No more war, no more debt, no more inflation, and no more empire. Peace out, guys. Catch you in the next one.